This section explains how physiology becomes something you can model and control. A physiological system is treated as a plant. You write the differential equations that approximate its behavior, and three capacities fall out of the same model: understanding, prediction, and control. The chapter's generative move is recognizing that the body already runs its own autonomous controller, homeostasis. So disease becomes controller failure, and medicine becomes an exogenous control law grafted onto a biological plant that can no longer regulate itself. Every later chapter is one instance of this. The artificial pancreas closes an insulin loop. Immunotherapy steers the cancer-immune balance. An exoskeleton supplies missing actuation. This is what the chapter is for. It installs the model, predict, control triad as the lens the whole book looks through. This section explains why the whole book treats the body as a control system and what follows from that. The body already runs controllers. Homeostasis is a feedback loop that the glands and the nervous system solve continuously, and disease is that loop failing. This chapter's thesis, which frames the whole book, is substitution. When the body's own controller breaks, you graft an engineered one around it, the way an artificial pancreas doses insulin where the islet no longer does. But you cannot control what you cannot model, so modeling strictly precedes control. Noble's cardiac cell equations from 1960 stand as the cornerstone. Every later chapter is one instance of the same two-step: glucose, tumor, gait, arrhythmia. First, you write the plant's differential equations, then you close a synthetic loop exactly where the natural regulation gave out. Modeling without a controller is mere prediction. The loop is the medicine. This section explains why cholesterol homeostasis is modeled mathematically rather than measured, and what the smallest honest model looks like. A model earns its keep as prediction, not as description. Cubica and Balbus open on exactly the constraint that makes this chapter necessary. Cholesterol regulation cannot be probed by experiment. Ethics forbids the human trial, and the rabbit is no substitute because its herbivore liver does no substitute, because its herbivore liver does not couple synthesis to blood level the way ours does not. The chapter's thesis is that a two-compartment ordinary differential equation is enough. One compartment is liver and blood, the other is peripheral tissue and blood. The two are coupled by de novo synthesis, dietary intake, tissue demand, biliary return, and exchange between the compartments. This is the smallest partition that still carries every flux. The arguments, this is the smallest partition that still carries every flux the argument depends on. Compression is the whole point. Fewer states than reality, but enough to predict where a drug should act. This is the book's homeostasis principle, rendered as a system you can actually integrate. This section explains how a whole body cholesterol system collapses into a two-reservoir model. A whole body metabolic network, synthesis, dietary intake, bile circulation, tissue demand, dozens of lipoprotein species, collapses into two coupled reservoirs, cholesterol in liver and blood, and cholesterol in peripheral blood, exchanging by first-order kinetics. That collapse is the chapter. The model is not built to reproduce the biochemistry. It is built to expose which regulatory rates a controller could grip. A well-built model is itself the measure of understanding. Keep only the fluxes that move. total plasma cholesterol de novo synthesis rate, limited by hepatic concentration, intake, enteral hepatic recycling, tissue uptake, keeping only those turns, an ethically and experimentally intractable system into a cheap predictive ordinary differential equation. The primitive is this. Reduce a physiological process to the minimal state space whose few couplings still carry every actuator. The therapy will pull. This section reads type 1 diabetes as a control problem. The starting point is a body whose dynamics drift faster than any fixed model can hold. The chapter's move is to refuse both a static plant model and a static controller tuned to it. Everything adapts online. The glycemic model is re-identified recursively. Plasma insulin is estimated from the glucose monitor, since no sensor reads it directly. Here is the real surprise. The model predictive controller's own set point, objective weights, and constraints are treated as time-varying state rather than fixed knobs. Machine learning pre-shifts them ahead of anticipated meals and exercise. The generative pattern is this. When the plant will not sit still, lift adaptation one level from tuning the model to tuning the controller that tunes to the model. This section explains why a body with no working beta cells needs a controller that never stops relearning. Such a body is a plant whose glucose dynamics drift faster than any fixed model can track. The dynamics are nonlinear, stochastic, delayed, different between people, and different within one person from hour to hour. The chapter's move is to refuse a static controller entirely. It identifies the glycemic model online, recursively, so the model stays valid across a diabetic's daily conditions. It then adapts the controller's own knobs, the set point, the objective weights, and the safety constraints to match. The primitive is adaptation, all the way down. Model predictive control aims at a target that is itself re-estimated each step, with machine learning pushing the adjustment ahead of anticipated meals and exercise. Safety enters as the hard constraint, never overdose insulin. That constraint bounds an estimator which cannot even measure plasma insulin directly. This section explains how a chapter on cancer treatment reframes therapy as the control of a dynamical system. A tumor and the immune system are two coupled populations, effector cells and cancer cells preying on each other like a Lotka-Volterra pair, with a time delay for the lag between antigen exposure and immune response. The chapter's move is to stop treating chemotherapy as poison, and to treat it instead as a control input steering that dynamical system. Once the biology is a plant with a state, the therapy schedule becomes the trajectory that minimizes a cost-functional tumor burden plus drug toxicity, subject to keeping healthy cells above their carrying capacity. Cure is no longer killing everything, but an optimal control problem solved by Pontryagin's principle. The primitive is this. Any disease with the dynamics becomes something you steer, not something you hit. This section explains how cancer therapy turns into a steering problem. You model the tumor and the immune system as two coupled populations, effector cells preying on tumor cells, the tumor growing logistically, a predator-prey field with a Michaelis-Menten saturation on the immune kill and a delay, tau, for the lag before recognition matures into response. Once the biology is a dynamical system, treatment stops being a dose and becomes a control variable injected into the equations. The clinical goal is then a cost functional to minimize, and that goal has three parts: shrink the tumor, spare the healthy tissue, spend the least drug. The whole chapter is that one move. You turn the question of what to give the patient into the question of what input drives this trajectory to the target at minimum cost. This section explains a diagnostic classifier rebuilt as a control loop. That is the whole move. A fuzzy rule base turns an expert's vague reasoning of the form if wide QRS then bundle branch block into machine classification. But its verdict depends entirely on where the membership functions sit and how many rules exist, and hand-tuning those is the bottleneck. So the chapter closes the loop. Treat the gap between predicted and true arrhythmia class as an error signal and let a genetic algorithm play the actuator that retunes the membership parameters until that error vanishes. This is exactly the standard controller's geometry. Reference minus output becomes correction with the genetic algorithm where the controller sits and the fuzzy classifier as the genetic algorithm where the controller sits and the fuzzy classifier as the plant. Learning becomes feedback control. The classifier is what the loop converges to. This section explains how a trained arrhythmia classifier is really a closed feedback loop. A classifier trained is a feedback loop closed. The chapter's one move is this. The error between the predicted arrhythmia and the true label plays exactly the role a tracking error plays in a servo. It actuates a genetic algorithm that retunes the fuzzy system's membership parameters until that error falls to 0. Fuzzy logic supplies the cardiologist's vague ECG rules. The genetic algorithm supplies what no expert can hand set, the precise shape of those rules. So, supervised training becomes disturbance rejection, and the whole apparatus snaps into the book's governing frame. Even labeling a heartbeat is a plant driven toward a set point. The set point here is the clinician's verdict. This section explains how the chapter models handwriting as a control system driven by muscle signals. Strip handwriting of everything cognitive, and what remains is a plant with an unknown transfer function. Forearm and hand muscle activations go in as 2 to 8 EMG channels. Pen tip coordinates on a two-dimensional plane come out. The chapter's whole move is to refuse the neuromuscular mechanism entirely and fit only that input-output map. This is black box identification, the same posture the rest of this control theory book takes toward physiological systems. Simple versus complex is then just one axis of the same map. Single orientation strokes like numbers and geometric forms against combined direction strokes like cursive Arabic letters. Everything downstream, the Kalman filter, the Zhang and Kamavuoko method, velocity, and the interval observer is a competing estimator of one plant, judged by how faithfully it reconstructs the trace. This part explains why the chapter treats handwriting as a black box and what single trade-off ranks every model in it. Handwriting becomes tractable the moment you stop modeling the hand and model only the map, forearm. EMG in, pen tip coordinates X and Y out, everything between, treated as one black box. The chapter's whole arc is a ladder of such input-output identifiers. Kalman fusion, a backprop net, a velocity model, an interval observer, all ranked by the same trade-off, reconstruction fidelity bought with parameter count and per-writer retuning. That recurring cost is the thesis. Because EMG is non-stationary and subjective, no fixed parameter set transfers. Each new trace demands recalibration, and the latter climbs toward robustness against exactly that drift. Read every model as one answer to the question. How cheaply can muscle drive predict trajectory, and you can now predict the next rung yourself. This section explains the single organizing idea behind medical robotics. A medical robot enters the clinic by extending exactly one agency, either the clinician's hand or the patient's lost function, Every taxonomy in this chapter reprojects that single binary. Dombre's split between assist doctor and assist patient, Dario's macro, micro, and bio scale, Taylor's 5 surgical roles, all of them are the scale, Taylor's 5 surgical roles, all of them are the same axis, seen from a different angle. The 2 poles each have an anchor. The Da Vinci system holds the first pole, teleoperated amplification of the surgeon. The myoelectric prosthesis holds the second, the restoration of a body. This chapter is the book's review rather than a control derivation. It maps the territory instead of deriving a controller, and its one governing constraint is safety. A machine touching a body must carry more certainty than an ordinary robot before it moves. Fix the axis, and you can place any new device yourself. This section explains how the entire field of medical robotics splits on a single question. What identifies a medical robot is whom it serves. The served party fixes its identity before its mechanism ever enters the picture. Brubaker's taxonomy, in Chapter 7, Figure 7, cuts the whole field on one relational bifurcation: machines that assist patients with health difficulties, meaning assistive technology and rehabilitation, versus machines that assist clinicians, meaning surgery. Everything downstream is a weave hanging off that single cut. The Da Vinci console, a myoelectric prosthesis, each one is just a branch of the two-way split. The chapter's second decisive move is that capability does not decide whether a device is deployed. Safety decides. Acceptance stalled for decades on the question of trust, not on raw performance. So the field reduces to a relation crossed with a constraint, the served party crossed with safety. Any new device locates its own branch before you even know its mechanism. This section explains why a prosthetic limb is best understood as a control loop, and why the chapter's whole argument turns on which half of that loop is missing. A prosthesis is a control loop. Every device this chapter catalogs lives on the forward path, the path that runs from intention out to motion. Produced. That includes body-powered devices, externally powered ones, and the myoelectric devices that read muscle signals. All of them carry the command outward and produce movement. Yet amputees abandon these devices. The reason is not weak actuators or too few degrees of freedom. The reason is that the return path is absent. Without touch and kinesthetic signals flowing back through the skin, the device never becomes part of the body and the loop stays open. So embodiment is a feedback problem. Closing the loop is what separates a tool that is merely worn from a limb that is owned. This section explains why a prosthesis can move perfectly and still never feel like part of the body. A prosthesis moves, yet the amputee never feels it is theirs, and the chapter's whole argument is that this is a problem of the control loop. The mechanics already work. What fails is the loop. Current myoelectric devices read the body, the efferent direction, muscle signal going out, but they never write back to it, the afferent direction, sensation coming in. Half the control loop is missing. So the device stays a tool. The user commands, never a limb. The nervous system reclaims. Reframe embodiment as bilateral communication. Close the sensory feedback path through the skin's mechanoreceptors, and adherence follows. Everything else in the chapter, the classification, body-powered versus externally powered, the emphasis on myoelectric control, hangs off that single gap the rest depends on. No feedback, no ownership. This section explains why an exoskeleton is worth building for upper limb rehabilitation and where the whole field gets stuck. An exoskeleton earns its place over end. Effector devices by one property. It maps onto the wearer's anatomical joints, so it commands individual joint torque rather than only the hand's endpoint. That same coupling explains the clinical gap, dozens of research prototypes, and a single commercial device. The bottleneck lives in the human exoskeleton interface. Every design axis, safety, comfort, joint alignment, actuation, and power transmission is a trade-off pinned there. Fuller range of motion costs weight and structural complexity. More compliance costs bandwidth. The chapter reads a survey of prototypes as a catalog of these trade-offs. The distance between what functions on a bench and what a hospital will strap on to a stroke patient. This section explains what defines an exoskeleton at the structural level. An exoskeleton is what its joints touch. The defining commitment is anatomical congruence. Each actuated axis coincides with one of the wearer's joints. And effector devices grip only the hand and control the endpoint. The exoskeleton instead maps joint onto joint, and that single choice generates everything downstream. From it flows the advantage: per joint torque, motion guidance, larger range, and richer feedback. Inseparable from that advantage comes the entire unsolved problem set: mass, power-to-weight ratio, alignment with the shifting human axes, donning and doffing speed, and control modularity. The chapter is a review precisely because that same congruence keeps the class in the laboratory. Dozens of prototypes exist. One is commercial. Read every later section as an audit of a single trade-off: fidelity to the human joint versus wearability. This section explains why walking on a treadmill is a regulator problem. The belt fixes your mean speed, so your position on the belt is the one variable that must not drift, and the nervous system controls exactly that, nothing more. The double pendulum is the plant. Step length, step time, and their ratio, which is velocity, are the actuated degrees of freedom. The chapter's primitive is that fluctuations in these per-stride quantities form a controlled manifold. The naive reading treats them as noise to be suppressed. In truth, the controller corrects the errors that would push you off-center and leaves the errors orthogonal to position free to wander. The treadmill's contribution is epistemic. It makes the goal variable observable, stride to stride, exposing which combinations the controller actually regulates and which ones it lets drift. This section explains how a walking gait reveals its control strategy through the statistics of its stride. A gait is a controller fighting noise, and its statistics betray how hard it fights. Model the walker as a double pendulum with two physical knobs. Push-off impulse sets step length. Rotational, spring stiffness, written K, sets step time. Give each stride variable its own feedback loop. Now inject noise into the parameters, and the stride-to-stride series inherit a signature. Statistical persistence means the nervous system corrects loosely. Anti-persistence means it corrects tightly. The chapter's move is to earn that signature from mechanics instead of fitting it in a black box. So variability stops reading as error and becomes the readout of which parameter the controller actually defends. This section explains the continuum. Naso Explorer, a manipulator that steers through the nose using shape memory actuators. Articulation without joints, that is the whole move. A rigid manipulator places motors at discrete pivots. The continuum design distributes bending along a flexible backbone, so the control variable stops being joint angle and becomes curvature itself, set continuously along the length. The nasal passage is narrow and nonlinear, so a jointed arm cannot thread it. A spine that curves everywhere can. The shape memory actuators close the pattern elegantly. The same wires that bend the structure are its muscle. Heat them past a phase transition, they contract, the backbone flexes. Cool them, they relax. Actuator and skeleton collapse into one material. Now predict the adjacent case. Any confined, tortuous lumen invites the same substitution of continuous compliance for discrete linkage. This section explains how Naso Explorer steers its tip without any conventional moving parts. The tip has no motors, no externally pulled tendons, and no return spring. The actuator is itself the skeleton. Naso Explorer bends by Joule heating sheath, memory alloy coil. Passing current drives the martensite to austenite transition. The alloy contracts and the flexible tip curls. The elegant move is placing 3 electrodes on one spring, closing the circuit over the proximal half or over the distal half, contracts that half while the other stretches. A single element becomes its own antagonist, curling both ways with nothing added to straighten it. That collapse of structure, actuator, and restoring force into one heated coil is what lets a self-administered nasopharynx probe fit under 5 millimeters and still sweep a wide viewing arc. This part explains how a surgical continuum robot changes its own stiffness on command. A continuum robot used in surgery has to contradict itself. It must be floppy enough to thread through narrow anatomy and rigid enough to cut and push tissue once it has arrived. The move here stops treating stiffness as a fixed property of the material and promotes it to an actuated variable, something the robot switches like any other control. The generative primitive is the auxetic tube. An auxetic material has a negative Poisson's ratio, which means it widens when you stretch it rather than necking down. So a single lengthwise pull converts into radial expansion. The inner tube swells and jams against an outer sleeve, and one control axis buys rigidity on demand. The whole chapter is that one substitution. Conformability and force application are usually welded together into a single material. Here, they are prized apart, so the second one becomes a tunable degree of freedom that you switch at the surgical site. This section explains how a single tendon can both steer a soft robot and stiffen it. Pull the tendon that steers the robot, and the same pull locks it rigid. One channel does both the actuation and the stiffening. The trick is the sign of Poisson's ratio. An auxetic inner tube widens when it is stretched, so tensile load presses it against a fixed outer sleeve until the two, jam and friction, resists all bending. Stiffness becomes a knob on force that is already applied. There is no vacuum seal, no heating element, no external field, no heating element, no external field to fail. The chapter's move is inversion. Rival methods add an energy channel to tune rigidity. A rheological fluid, a phase change, a negative pressure. This design reuses the drive itself. The boundary is this: rigidity climbs with pull, so grip and steering draw on one budget.